Yeah. So Barbara, I'm going to just ask you about followership and leadership since, and I don't, I'm really uh, where it works for me is like when you are in different uh, positions of authority, you're clearly following someone who's in a difference of authority. But when you're in the same group, that relationship is not as clear. It's more dynamic, right? And because of the human tendency that we've already talked about, to defer judgment to somebody else, to want someone to be our, the patriarchy, to want someone to come and tell us what to do. I just feel that the word socializing the word fellowship is unintentionally, playing into kind of preserving this patriarchal dynamic. And so maybe there's not another good alternative. I know that's not your intention, but that's why I push back against it a little. And I'll say one more thing. I usually it's fine if people talk about following and leading. I feel perfectly fine. But followership and leadership sounds like a role or a position that's just a shade too fixed to me.
So, Tom, I don't disagree. I have found it is impossible to talk about this stuff, however, and to write about it without using some term. One could use, as I said earlier, constituent or stakeholder or whatever. I have chosen to stay with follower for the reasons that I said earlier. In English, it's the only, it's not only the obvious antonym, it's the only antonym. And as I think about it, most of us, most of the time, are expected actually to follow. So if you go, let's say, to, in a classroom for children, mostly they're expected to follow. They're mostly expected to do what the teacher tells them to do. In the home, even before they go to school, mostly children are, even now, still expected to do what their parents tell them to do. Once you go to the workplace, mostly workers, employees are still expected to do what their leaders and managers tell them to do. They're expected, most of us, most of the time, are still expected to follow. We can't, and by the way, we must follow for groups and organizations to work. I don't know if you've heard of Robert Mickels's iron law of oligarchy. Even in democratic, it's wonderful, Tom, I commend it to you.
Okay.
Even in democratic systems, leaders rise to the top because we need leaders to organize our collective work, whether it's a company or a country. And it implies that the rest of us need a good amount of the time, not all of the time, to go along, to follow. Campuses won't work if students and faculty and administrators are forever screaming and yelling and baquat. At some point, this must stop in order for institutions of higher education to do what they are supposed to do. So if you look at the amount of time that we are, all of us, again, from childhood all the way through adulthood, and the same applies to citizenship. I don't have to follow Joe Biden. Let's say I'm going to vote for Joe Biden. Doesn't mean I have to follow him. I don't even have to vote for him. But unless most of us are willing to buy into the system, if we do what happened on January 6th, if we are not willing to somehow behave ourselves and contain ourselves, the system's going to break apart. So that's, and the reason I think the word follower is so important, and this is, I think, where you and I generally do differ. I would argue that if people are unwilling to follow a lot of the time, not always, God knows, apropos Hitler, but most of the time, the systems can't function, whether it's a company, whether it's an institution of higher education, whether it's a liberal democracy more generally. We have to accept most of the time there are leaders and most of the time there are followers. And if too many followers disrupt the proceedings too much of the time, the system's going to break apart, whatever that system consists of.
Yeah.
So I define the term subordinate, are students expected generally to follow their instructors? And one last sentence, Tom. Followers have become, and I mentioned this when I spoke, but it's really important. I can tell you from my experience as a teacher, the students now are not what they were 25 years ago. they're more demanding, they're more disruptive, they're more ready to complain about an assignment that's too demanding, they're more ready to object if a grade they get from me is too harsh. Followers, again, emboldened by changes in technology and changes in the culture, they're very quick to bitch and moan. But unless people are given to understand, unless we go back to things like civic education, it's not going to be so great for liberal democracy.
Well, I just want to jump in for a second,
Yeah.
because when you were talking, and I read Professionalizing Leadership last year and really enjoyed it, there's something about what you're talking about that seems to me to have to do with discipline and self-discipline. That there seems to be a lack of accountability to the larger whole and regulating oneself in relation to the context that is leading to these kind of issues. And the military seems to drill discipline in. And is that maybe why they're more successful in cultivating leadership?
Every word you said, Jonathan, I agree with. It is in inculcating people with the idea that they not only have rights, but they have responsibilities. And that second part of the equation seems to be increasingly lost. And if it's too lost, that's why I think a lot of democracies are, the numbers of democracies globally has declined for 20 years. Lots of democracies, whether our own or whether in Europe, are running into trouble from the far right. People don't like it if there's too much disorder. They're going to turn to a quote strongman. And those of us who encourage people to, realize their own preferences and whatever without understanding exactly what you said, Jonathan, I think are missing the point.
So where I would agree with you is you need cohesion and direction for a group to be effective. You can't be renegotiating direction and renegotiating cohesion at every moment. So at some point you have to agree, and in some cases you need to just to defer to the person in charge and follow.
The social
I 100%
contract
agree.
requires that. Otherwise, the social contract breaks apart.
Yeah.
Exactly.
The other thing that I think is related to this, I think often of when I did my PhD at Gonzaga was when No Child Left Behind was coming in. And a lot of my colleagues were superintendents and principals, and they were noticing how the teacher training programs were teaching teachers to teach to the test. And reflective critical thinking was not being trained at all. And I wonder how much that is also systemically contributing to the degradation of society in that way.
It's all related. By the way, so is parenting. Everybody agrees parenting is more relaxed now. The parents used to be figures of authority, and now we're helicopter parenting. And this, every painting that every kid does gets put on the kitchen wall because it's so magnificent. That's what I mean when I talk about cultural changes.
Yeah.
They are in many ways good, but not in every way. And I think those of us interested in these issues, I think, need to pay attention to all of them.
And is that the good part of conservatism, conserving some of these core foundational values and principles and practices that become the robust foundation of healthy society?